The year is 1958. Chrysler wants an engine to replace the firepower Hemi because those engines were expensive to produce and heavy. Chrysler also wanted to simplify things. Every year they made a different Hemi engine for every single Chrysler product. Chrysler more or less wanted to streamline things. The new engine would be called the Chrysler Wedge engine because of the wedge-shaped combustion chambers. Remember, up until this point, Chrysler V8s used different types of combustion chambers. First the Hemi head, then the poly head. Chrysler was an engineering company, a far cry from the plastic shell they are today. In this episode, we will cover both Chrysler B and Chrysler RB engines. The Chrysler B, or low block engine, had displacements of 350, 361, 383, and 400. The RB, or raised block, 383, 413, 426W, and 440. We are going from base horsepower to max horsepower. We are not getting into all of the horsepower figures for every year that these engines were produced. Bore and stroke sizes may be rounded. It's also important to note that most of these horsepower figures are gross, meaning that they're the best world numbers without power-robbing accessories hooked up, such as belt-driven accessories like generators, alternators, power steering, air conditioning, compressors, water pumps, etc. The Chrysler wedge engine was a big block engine which featured wedge-shaped combustion chambers in the cylinder head, stamped steel shaft-mounted rocker arms, external oil pump, which was camshaft driven, 17 cap screws per cylinder head. The cylinder block extends 3 inches below the crankshaft center line. Engineers would also move the distributor to the front and place it at a 45-degree angle to alleviate any clearance issues. The engine was also mounted lower in the chassis, which would also lower the center of gravity. Chrysler would build the wedge engine for 20 years, 1958 through 1978. We are going to start with the Chrysler B engines and then move on to the RB engines. Introduced in 1958, 350 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve, Chrysler B, 5.7 liters. It's good for 295 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, 385 pound-feet, or 522 newton meters at 2,800 RPM. With a bore of 4.1 inches and a stroke of 3.4 inches, compression is 10-1, 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used, it was only used in 1958. It could be found in the Dodge Coronet, Plymouth Fury, DeSoto Fire Sweep. Side note, all parts except pistons will work on the 361 V8, which was also introduced in 1958, and it's very similar to the 350 but with a larger bore, 361 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve. V8 Chrysler B, 5.9 liters. It's good for 295 to 333 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. 400 pound-feet or 542 newton meters at 3,600 RPM with a bore of 4.12 inches and a stroke of 3.4 inches. Compression is 10-1. 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was between the years of 1958 through 1965. It could be found in the Dodge Coronet, Dodge Trucks. 361 offered fuel injection in 1958. Chrysler would bore the 361 out to 383 cubic inch displacement in 1959. It's important to note that Chrysler would make 2 versions of the 383 in this same wedge family. This is the first version. This is the more plentiful version. 383 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve, Chrysler B V8, 6.3 liters. It's good for up to 335 horsepower, 4,600 RPM, up to 460 pound-feet, or 624 newton meters at 3,600 RPM with a bore of 4.25 inches and a stroke of 3.4 inches. Compression is 10-1, 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was from 1959 all the way out till 1971. It could be had in the Dodge D500, 1959 through 1960 DeSoto, 1962 through 71 Plymouth Sport Fury. They made over 3 million of these. Introduced in 1972 to replace the 383 400 cubic inch displacement overhead valve Chrysler B 6.6 liter V8. It could make anywhere between 170 to 260 horsepower at 4,800 RPM. This engine came out when net horsepower figures came into effect. So the 170 doesn't sound all that impressive, but that was with everything hooked up, plus smog stuff coming in. 410 pound-feet, or 556 newton meters at 3,200 RPM, with a bore of 4.342 inches and a stroke of 3.4 inches. Compression was 8.2 to 1. 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was between 1972 to 1979. It could be found in the 1975 Charger, amongst many other cars. Introduced in 1959, and conflicting information as to when the RB block was discontinued. Some say 78, other sources say 79. The RB used a taller block, and all the RB engines are over square. The block is around 3/4 of an inch taller than the regular B block or lower block design, making its debut in 1959. The 383 cubic inch displacement RB overhead valve. And the only reason this engine exists is because the original 383 turned out to be a really popular engine designed by Chrysler, and Chrysler just couldn't keep up with production. So they took the 413R block and debored it, bored it smaller, and built the 383 out of the RB block. These are two totally different animals, the RB and the B 383. Nothing interchanges between these two engines. 383 cubic inch displacement RB overhead valve V8, 6.3 liters. It's good for 325 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, 425 pound-feet, or 576 newton meters at 2,800 RPM, with a bore of 4.031 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. This engine was called the Golden Lion. It was only offered in Chrysler, Windsor, and Saratoga from 1959 through 1960. Only 100,000 of these were made. Also introduced in 1959, the legendary 413 cubic inch displacement overhead valve RB V8, 6.8 liters. It's good for anywhere between 340 to 390 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, up to 530 pound-feet, or 712 newton meters at 3,600 RPM, with a bore of 4.1875 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. Compression is 10 to 1. Years this engine was used was between 1959 through 1965 in cars, up until 1979 in medium-duty/heavy-duty trucks. It could also be found in the Polara, Chrysler New Yorker, Facial Vega. It's worth mentioning in 62, there was a max wedge version, which would produce 420 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. Introduced in 1963, and don't get this confused with the 426 Hemi, totally different beast. Chrysler really had a knack for offering the same displacements of engine in different engine families. Case in point, 318 Poly is totally different than a 318 LA, or 383B is totally different than a 383 race block. This is another one. 426W was Chrysler's main performance engine until the 426 Hemi came out. Cataloged as option S42 in Chrysler. 426 cubic inch displacement, RB overhead valve V8, 7 liters. It's good for anywhere between 373 to 425 horsepower, 4,600 RPM, up to 480 pound-feet, or 651 newton meters at 3,800 RPM, with a bore of 4.25 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. Compression is anywhere between 11 to 12 to 1. Years this engine was used was from 1963 through 1965. It could be found in the Dodge Polara, Plymouth Fury, amongst other cars. It's worth mentioning the Max Wedge version, race-only version of the 426, known as Superstock for Plymouth and Ramcharger for Dodge. Max Wedge featured high-flow cylinder heads, which were state-of-the-art back then. They also included 1 7/8 inch exhaust valves. Cylinder bores had to be notched for clearance. The block was cast special with larger oil feed passages. than the average RB engine blocks. Cross-ram intake perched at the top. The max wedge was factory rated at 415 or 425 horsepower, which seems like a very conservative figure, all things considered. 480 pound-feet or 651 newton meters. There was also other stages, like Stage 2, which had improved combustion chambers and camshafts. Stage 3 came in 64. None of the stages changed the factory horsepower figure. There was a 426 street wedge, was available in 64 and 65. The street wedge was only available in B-body cars, Dodge and Plymouth, and light-duty Dodge D trucks. Introduced in 1965 and would be produced until 1978, light wall construction precision cast iron block with iron heads, 440 cubic inch displacement RB overhead valve V8 7.2 liters. It's good for anywhere between 225 to 390 horsepower, 4,700 RPM, up to 490 pound-feet or 664 newton meters at 3,200 RPM with a bore of 3.2 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. It could be found in just about everything from the Chrysler 300, Newport, New Yorker, Dodge B Series van, Corvette, Charger, Plymouth Fury, Roadrunner, GTX, among many other vehicles. As with all good things, they must eventually come to an end. Emissions, fuel shortages would end this engine family. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. These are kind of all over the place, but which one would you rather have? And it's also important to note that all of these options have the Chrysler wedge engine in them. But which one would you rather have? 1959 Plymouth Fury or 1962 Facial Vega 2 or 1970 Dodge Challenger? I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Moving on to the second scenario, 1960 Imperial Crown or 1966 Jensen FF or 1964 Chrysler 300. Once again, I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Hint, that's a newer song. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below or check out our Facebook group that correlates with this YouTube channel. I call it the After Party. Gives you the opportunity to share your ride stories, experiences, anything car related is definitely shareable on there. If you don't have Facebook and would still like to reach me, send me You Got Mail. I appreciate all of the information that you guys share in the comment section. I love the stories. I love you guys sharing the memories. Until next time, toodaloo!